Hello and welcome to The Appetite, a podcast brought to you by Opal Food and Body Wisdom, an eating disorder treatment center in Seattle, Washington. The Appetite is all about issues of food, body, sport, and mental health, and we bring kind of what we do as eating disorder experts to the general population, talking about how eating disorder issues actually are things that really everybody could learn from. I'm your host, Carter Umhau, a therapist, artist, and writer, and today I'm going to be sitting down with Opal co-founder and head of the exercise and sport program, Bazzi. We're going to be discussing weight within athletic performance. Is it ever okay to be focused on weight to enhance performance? This is something that is really kind of an assumption that you should be focused on weight within some sports, but we have talked at length before about why that actually can be quite harmful and why we really believe the opposite. So we're going to be talking through that today.
Yeah.
Welcome, Kara.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Some of you listeners may have heard a previous podcast episode that was called Was I Only Fast Because I Was Anorexic? And that was unpacking a little bit of my story as a distance runner and addressing the issue of weight and performance. And we had our sport dietitian, Kelly Finan, on the episode to also address it from a nutrition perspective. And so this feels somewhat of a follow-up. And we recorded that episode, about a year ago.
Yeah, probably
maybe.
Year. Yeah. And we'll be linking it down just so you know.
In case you want to catch up on that if you haven't heard it. And that was, of course, before Mary Cain, the distance runner, came out, in November of this past year about her own experiences as a professional athlete running for the Nike Oregon Project under Coach Alberto Salazar and her experiences around how weight and food and body was handled in that culture and calling it out as toxic. So there has been, since Mary Cain's disclosure nationally, there are so many more conversations happening. And so it's exciting. It feels like a really big opportunity to come back to this question and maybe talk about it a little bit more in detail today in our session. So I'm excited that more people seem to be interested in this topic. And it feels like an opportunity, again, for people in our field, in the eating disorder world, to offer to the sport world some concepts and some ideas that seem really relatable as coaches and athletes are trying to unpack and understand the role of weight and performance. Yeah, it's cool.
It is cool. It is cool. And I think what's particularly cool to me is that it's becoming less of an assumption that to be at in a smaller body and at a lower weight is going to be helpful to you.
Right. Totally. And I think, where I see a lot of agreement is the education and the science coming out about relative energy deficiency in sport, which is basically all systems are negatively impacted by not having enough adequate nutrition. And I feel like there's agreement about that. If that is the way to manipulate a body to lose weight for performance, at some point that's just going to be destructive for performance because there's not enough nutrition and fuel to support the body and to support the psychology. So that feels like there's maybe more understanding and agreement, but it does beg the question and leaves kind of the question, especially for those that are more in elite athletics, around, well, would we ever be considering these things? Would we ever be talking about manipulation of nutrition or the conversation about periodization in sport? Would we consider times in the calendar year around racing or competition that there would be room for some manipulation and there would be room for making those changes in order for peak performance? So that's kind of where I wanted to dive into a little bit today of those nuanced questions. Like, Would we ever want to talk about body comp? Would we ever want to talk about a time that you would want to lean out, as I know people talk about? When and what age of athletes could we be thinking about that for, et cetera? So one thing we'll be linking is, I thought this was really interesting. This came out, early January. It came out the morning I was doing a coach's workshop. The coach's workshop we've talked about before on the podcast, but it's a infograph. Would you call this an infographic?
Yeah,
an infographic.
One of the original infographics that looks a lot like the food pyramid that I would have seen in first grade at school.
Totally. It's a triangle.
Yeah.
It's a pyramid. But I think it was put out by a few folks. Dr. Kate Ackerman, who is a sports medicine doctor in Boston, And she had partnered with actually a couple professional athletes, Kara Goucher and Lauren Fleshman. And I might be missing people, but basically they're trying to get more conversation, more things into the research to create change within the sport culture. And so they put out this pyramid, which is trying to get at conceptualizing when we might be able to do body composition assessments, periodization, and what would be needing to be in place. So on the one hand, it is tracking nutritional skills. So in this chart, it says at the bottom, you need foundational nutrition skills. Then they have a developing portion and an advanced portion. And on the other side, they have an athlete stage development. So they have a developing athlete, a national or collegiate level, which is the middle of the triangle, and then an elite professional level is the top of the triangle. So basically, they're trying to track an athlete's development, how kind of at what level they are in athletics, and I would say development from an age perspective, alongside these nutritional skills. And essentially, they're saying at the bottom of the triangle for a developing athlete and foundational skills, really you should not be doing any body comp assessments and no focus on kind of body composition, weight when it comes to performance outcomes. So I think in that category, I'm thinking of, the high school athlete, the youth athlete, where somebody is growing and developing and they haven't even finished their body development, essentially, right? They should be growing and changing and developing and getting larger, getting more fat, et cetera. Like that is not a place to be focusing on that. It's about all the other things to take care of oneself and to grow a person well, essentially. And then it gets to be a little bit more vague, right? Then the middle of this triangle, it's talking about limited focus on body composition, only from a health perspective, it says. And then when you get up to the top of the triangle, it's talking about that this body comp can be, and periodization can be approached only with mature athletes with positive self-body image, okay? So the concept is that you can kind of have this focus at the top of the pyramid when somebody has advanced nutritional skills and is an elite athlete. So
sounds.
What do you think about that, Carter?
It sounds really overly simplified, knowing that sounds like a good plan. Mm-hmm. But knowing that most people, regardless if they're athletes or not, actually don't get almost any foundational skills with food taught to them in any way, I can imagine this being pretty difficult to make sure that the nutritional skills are as, kind of elevated as the actual athletic development. Mm-hmm. And their success isn't going to necessarily mean that they've figured out the way that they should be responding to food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's a good starting place, again, as a response to all the conversation that's been happening. And yet the vagueness of, well, what does even foundational developing and advanced nutrition skills mean? How would any coach use that at this point? And I certainly don't know where they want to go with this information and what they might have in the works. So, I applaud them for to try to keep the train moving forward. When I first saw this triangle, I immediately thought of Ellen Satter's work. And we've talked about that on the podcast before. But she also has a triangle called the Hierarchy of Food Needs, and really unpacks what I would imagine in some ways are these nutritional skills and specifics about what kind of foundational skills need to be built up to get to the point where instrumental eating would be an option for somebody.
And can you just describe a little bit more about what instrumental eating would look like anyways? Mm-hmm. What are we talking about there?
Yeah, so instrumental eating, maybe to put it into the context of sport, I would say that's where we're talking about some periodization around nutrition things. It's talking a little bit about more of the functional part, so that might be where you're using supplements. In her terms, instrumental eating would be based on kind of foundation of all these other parts about eating. So it still would involve adequate eating. You'd be getting enough food, but you would be working with manipulating or making decisions, not manipulating in a bad way, but making different decisions that you believe your body would be needing for peak performance that has to do with making nutrition decisions, right? So like it might be supplementation, it might be particular things that you are being aware of with minerals or vitamins, or paying attention to some of those particular things that might be maybe less relevant when you're not training as hard and you're more focusing on your rest and recovery. Another idea behind instrumental eating for an athlete, and I could be slightly not describing this accurately. I'm not a sports dietitian, but I do know that this would be a place where people would consider doing the training. It's called training low. And my understanding is that you would be kind of going a little bit in a carbohydrate deficit before a competition. And the idea is then when you do kind of then get the carbs right before the competition, that the body can absorb those carbs better for the competition, especially for an endurance event. So that would be, again, I might not be describing that exactly accurately, but to kind of illustrate the point that could be another thing, like a way that you're kind of talking about instrumental eating. You're using strategies nutritionally, essentially, that you believe lead to better performance.
So you're manipulating the performance by the food that you're eating in a really particular way at a particular time within your training schedule.
Right.
So when you referenced Ellen Satter's hierarchy of food needs earlier, where does this idea of instrumental eating land and what comes before it that is really important?
Great question. So that's at the top of the triangle,
Okay,
Carter.
so very advanced
Yes. And
skill.
this is where it talks about advanced nutritional skills. So the thing is, I think a lot of athletes skip, this is a big point, skip all these other foundational skills and go into instrumental without having competency. I love that word, competency, with these other foundational skills. And I mean, that's very, very, very a significant part of building competency, building your kind of what allows somebody to be able to have kind of ease and freedom with food. These skills are so key so that when you're instrumentally eating, you're not putting yourself at risk for disordered eating patterns. I mean, that's huge. So you're kind of playing with fire if you don't have some of these foundational skills. And maybe some people can do the instrumental eating and not develop disordered eating patterns. But I think a lot of us, especially in the distance running community, have the same story where we went instrumental and we didn't have other skills. And, then things went on a bad path.
Is there also concern that without the instrumental eating skill that, yes, there would be disordered eating that could happen right then and there, but also that maybe there would be some sort of nutritional deficiency already? Is that part of the risk that
possibly
someone's maybe not even taking care of themselves yet to be able to do that?
Totally, because the very bottom of the pyramid is the enough food. So that is really highlighting the first and foremost adequate eating. How many athletes know if they're adequately eating? That's a huge question mark, especially because there's a lot of unintentional inadequate eating. We're not just talking about people that are intentionally restricting. There's so much unintentional inadequate eating. And how do you even know if you have enough, right? Like that's a big question as an athlete. How do you know?
Yeah.
Question mark, right? You might not be afraid of eating, but how do you even know if you're getting enough in your body?
Yeah. I know that this is a funny example, but I watched Miss Americana, the Taylor Swift documentary.
I started that last night.
Yeah. I watched it last night too. That's so funny.
Weird.
I know.
Okay.
And Taylor Swift was talking about when she was struggling with an eating disorder and, as one of the top pop stars in the entire world, she has a very active schedule and a very active, physically demanding job to be performing for hours every single night, right? So we maybe wouldn't call her an athlete, but she's
active.
She's incredibly active, right? And she was saying, I had no idea that in the middle of a show, I wasn't supposed to feel dizzy.
Right.
That I wasn't supposed to feel like I was about to faint. I thought that just meant that I was working really hard. And I knew I wasn't like eating very much. And I kind of watched myself get more and more obsessive about it. But I thought I was supposed to be that tired. And she was like, gaining weight is the thing that has made everything else easier and better in my life. So
it's actually a great example.
Beautiful, right?
It's a great example.
She had no idea that she was as underfed as she would and what the signs were.
Totally. And that's where, like, just to make another plug for the REDS model, the relative energy deficiency in sport, like those symptoms can be the kind of signal that there isn't enough nutrition. Cues is a good start. Cues, especially if somebody isn't necessarily intentionally restricting.
Cues meaning?
Cues, your hunger and fullness cues.
Yeah, okay.
Like oftentimes they're very reliable, but especially we know with sports, cues can be really kind of messed with when you're training.
Yeah.
And so we kind of talk about mechanical eating has to happen around kind of sport, the training portion of the sport. We really rely a lot of times on mechanical eating, and then we can lean into cues outside of that part. But they're not always reliable to show us if we have inadequate energy availability. So those signs are also another kind of catch to see if we're having enough, if we're having kind of like what Taylor Swift was experiencing, right? Then that could show.
Yeah,
Point to that.
And it reminds me of our episode on shifting toxic sport culture around the fact that, like, you know, maybe you have a sense of internal regulation cues with appetite, but do you have regulation skills in knowing where your limit is in a culture that says no pain, no gain?
Right.
And do you have the regulation skill to go, you know what, I've pushed past my limit 3 times over now, and I've actually hit the real limit, and here are the signs in my body.
Right.
Like, I can imagine that not actually being something that a lot of athletes could feel very clear on.
Yeah, totally.
Maybe not.
Totally. Like, I think that question gets brought into our groups often in Rethinking Exercise and Sport at Opal around how do we know when we're like pushing ourselves, kind of that healthy pushing versus the pushing that would, you know, not be supportive of having kind of a healthy body, right? But the signs that we talk about within the sport context, we would want to know, like, be concerned if there's dizziness, if there's fatigue. In fatigue, I mean, I think sometimes athletes would know, like, fatigue from a hard workout versus kind of a general fatigue, or seeing a difference in a workout between workouts. Like, why did I feel a certain way in this 1 year of competition and my workouts, and now I'm just generally feeling a pattern of a different level of energy. Dehydration. I mean, there's definitely a lot of those kind of physical symptoms. Cold intolerance can also be a physical symptom that could suggest not enough nutrition for an athlete. And of course, you could always, if you have access and availability to a sport dietitian, then they can really help hone in a little bit more too of what your needs would be and do some more science around that with calculations. Again, there's some mystery to it, but at least some more general ideas. So adequate food.
Yeah, that's the number one.
Yeah. So, okay, if you don't have adequate food, you shouldn't be in some ways, like instrumental eating, you're not ready for it.
Yep.
Right?
Should be eating more first.
And so then this next one is acceptable food. Once you're sure you're getting enough to eat, you can develop more discriminating taste. You can reject foods that don't appeal to your appetite. Kelly, our sports dietitian, talks about you're getting all the macronutrients, like you're getting enough carbs, proteins, and fats. Like carbs, proteins, and fats are essential.
If you're just eating enough.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And so then you're kind of I guess both of these next ones, acceptable food and reliable ongoing access to food, is that this is where you are having kind of the consistency of the adequacy. It's consistent across all these kind of maybe barriers like time and schedules and
setting
and access, but that you have the skills we've talked about on our podcast, contextual skills. You have the contextual skills to reduce the barriers to have that consistency ongoing. You're adequately eating ongoing. So for example, I heard an athlete talking about one of the barriers for her to have consistent, adequate nutrition is that the times of her practices and classes didn't lend to being able to get, to the cafeteria was essentially closed. Her on-campus cafeteria she couldn't have access to because of the barrier with time. And so that's a problem, right? Mm-hmm. And she didn't have enough of her own financial means to get her own food, right? So there's an access issue. So somebody responsibly, I think, to do in that situation is to then at least advocate, right? Have a conversation with coach, have a conversation with someone on campus to problem solve that strategy, right? Like that was a real barrier. Yep. And yet that is such an essential part of taking care of oneself is the consistency of the eating. So if there are barriers that are kind of out of your control, then how do you advocate in order to make that change? And honestly, like if they were really resistant to making that change, you kind of wonder about whether that's the right place for her. For an athlete, time changes with travel. Like that's kind of a big deal.
In terms of impacting like what schedule you'd be on with eating?
Yep. Like that can be a really big thing for traveling, kind of across the country, having competitions maybe even international competitions. You're thinking about recovery window of like, this is where that mechanical eating, you're still, you're having your body consistently eat in the recovery window as an athlete, regardless of whether your cues are telling you you're hungry or not. So this is that consistency, contextual skills, problem solving. Again, I would want to see those things being really in place and competent, and kind of a no questions about that, right? Like that your body needs that before you would, again, move into some kind of instrumental eating. And then those next two on the pyramid, good tasting and novel, syncs back up with eating attitudes.
Oh, the eating attitudes.
Yeah,
yes.
the eating attitudes that there's...
And just some context, we're talking still about kind of some ways of thinking about these hierarchy of food needs and competency skills through dietitian Ellen Satter's work. And we did 4 episodes on those 4 different skills. So you can go back. They're episodes 64 through 67. We'll link them. But that's what we're referencing.
Yes.
These really crucial categories in understanding our relationship to food.
So novel and good, I think of for the athlete where this sort of fits in my mind is the pleasure and the fun and that aspect. And that can be tricky for an athlete as well, because an athlete can really hone in on nutrition as mainly functional. Again, kind of going into that instrumental place before also having both the enough and the place of food where pleasure's an aspect of it. That's just generally speaking, I think a trickier thing within an athlete's life is how do you incorporate pleasure and play, especially if it's been with exercise, with food in general, seeing the value of it, seeing that in the big picture of sustainability as an athlete. My belief is strongly held that is a vital part of kind of sustainability in sport and athletics is maintaining pleasure. It reminds me of this piece on this podcast. We're actually going to be interviewing Tina Muir. She's a British runner, and she has a podcast, and she's really in the sport world. And she interviewed Kara Goucher after the Mary Cain episode.
Who's Kara Goucher? And
Kara Goucher, again, ran for Nike Organ Project. She is, I think she's still competing and still running. Their episode was about weight and performance as well. And she talked about leaning out right before her races, and even kind of what I would say, like giving up some of these more good tasting foods. So she talks about dessert and alcohol being things that she would abstain from a few weeks before she'd race for this small window of time. And what I loved in this podcast is Tina, after she kind of talks about it. And then Tina, just asks this question. She's like, well, do you think you needed to do that? And then Kara pauses and she goes on to say, well, yeah, I mean, that's just been ingrained. I mean, that mentality of that kind of way of periodizing, it's been ingrained from coaches kind of her whole career. And about her leaning out and the body weight changing at the last bit. But then she sits there and she's like, actually, when in reality, it probably didn't matter. And for a professional athlete to say that, like even in that moment of being asked that question and like, actually it probably didn't. And then she goes on and talks about there was a big celebratory meal for something related, I can't remember, to her husband. And it was the night before a race. And she just let herself enjoy and celebrate and eat and drink and kind of really just respond to what she wanted to in the moment of the celebration. And she had an awesome race the next day. So she just was like, well, she caught evidence of her own of that right in the moment of the conversation. And I highlight that because really are we working with truth? And I appreciated that example because the things she cut out were these things that gave her pleasure. And she did say, like, I wouldn't be able to give up desserts and alcohol a year because I like them. But then she was doing them for the 3 weeks and she could pivot back and it didn't seem to cause her too much distress. Yeah. But she obviously cares about having pleasure in her eating. Right. And did she even really need to do it for the 3 weeks? I'm like, thank you. Thank you for bringing that question. And
yeah, it kind of pokes at it almost as if it's really more about superstition in some ways, like kind of
placebo effect.
Yes,
too.
exactly. The placebo effect, or the thought that if you do this thing, then you'll be psychologically prepared. I mean, that's what I hear, like that you're doing everything in your control to be perfect enough or in perfect shape or in perfect this or perfect that to perform better suddenly. But actually, there are other things to consider that would also boost your performance or your happiness that week or your energy.
Yep. We've talked about before rituals in sport performance because athletes can heavily lean into them and they can be positive.
Right.
But then the question is what happens if they're not there and then you're kind of holding your hat on it.
I think that my question about that, and I'm sure maybe a lot of people listening would be wondering about this too, playing devil's advocate, I suppose, is that why, if we're saying that, why even cut the alcohol and the sweets right before the race? Isn't that kind of a double standard to then think but there might be a time where there is a use for instrumental
This is
eating?
where I want to separate instrumental eating from this leaning out and body comp.
Okay, so what is it in differentiation from that?
Okay, so when I think about instrumental eating, I think about that the motive is not to change shape.
Okay.
The motive isn't to lean out. The motive isn't to lose weight. When it comes to periodization of body composition and this idea, even using the Kara Goucher example, that she was taking those two things out of her diet to lose to lose weight right before the race. I feel more strongly about that being used because what would happen if those things that she didn't lend itself in weight loss? That, again, to me, supposes, as she kind of talked about it, that just is what happened to her body. And it could have just happened to her body. She could have body knowledge that knows kind of how her body responds to different things. But oftentimes, if the goal is to lose weight or to lean out, again, you're playing with fire because you don't know how your body responds to different things, right? So it's not the weight loss is a secondary thing to kind of another motivation. If your outcome is that you want to lean out or lose weight before a competition, that I would say you're getting in dangerous territory. And I wouldn't recommend that. I wouldn't even recommend it on the higher pyramid. And that to me feels very different in distinguishing from using nutrition strategies. And within nutrition strategies, kind of why would one do it?
Yeah.
To me, it's why would one do anything else? It can be one of the many things that people are exploring about themselves and seeing how it impacts. I would want it to come from more of an experimentation, knowing one's body, thinking about the many factors, just the same as sleep. How am I impacted by different levels of sleep? How am I impacted by stress? How am I impacted by hydration? How am I impacted by nutrition? Where you want to have caution is the links we're making as athletes of things being causal when they might be associated, right? Because you can misattribute things, right? You could have an awesome race and be well, I did these 3 things the night before and attribute your awesome race to those 3 things, but those might not be the 3 things of why you had your awesome race.
Yeah.
So you have to, I would hold a lot of that. I think holding a lot of that lightly, but if somebody has more of that interest around kind of that nutrition component of how they're being impacted by what the decisions they're making with nutrition. Again, if they have all of these other competencies in place, I think that can be one of many other things that they're kind of exploring in their toolbox, especially when we're talking about elite and professional athletes, right? Where you are sort of uncovering, this is your job, and you're uncovering the different aspects of your life that could help and lend to peak performance. And for some elite athletes, I would imagine having nutrition off the table in that way might be better for peak performance because of the anxiety it could create. That might be part of knowing oneself.
And I think you said this earlier, maybe not on recording, but you said something about how it's basically 99% of the time this isn't a thing that we should be worried about. And maybe just 1%, there's a time where there is some question to be asked around what could be useful.
Yeah. It just feels like there's so much harm that's been done when we fixate on this. And of course, we get into, there's the risk factors of this disordered eating component and preoccupation and kind of misery that can come with all of this. But I also think there are people where they do pay more attention to some of the science or the specifics, and they enjoy it.
Yep.
And it's okay. But again, I would say probably even if they don't have language for it, I would imagine, I guess I would assume, I'd love to talk, like unpack, like get more data on this, but to see that they have these other components of their relationship with food in place, because we know that if they're not, especially if they're not eating adequately, then it just is like a no-go.
Right.
For those of you that are listening that do identify with as an athlete and think about kind of this nutrition part in sport, one thing I wanted to maybe read off a couple aspects of what a competent eater how they might be approaching food. And then you can kind of look at yourself through this lens and see what kind of comes up for you as I read a couple of these statements, where there's an integration of what we're eating and how we're eating it and the mindset around the eating. So a few of these: I'm relaxed about eating. I'm comfortable about eating enough. I feel it's okay to eat foods I like. I'm comfortable with my enjoyment of food and eating. I trust myself to eat enough for me. So those are things to chew on. No pun intended. Cheesy.
I think that they do serve as like some just little reminders of what a more relaxed, at peace relationship with food would look like, and how important that actually can be to performance itself.
Exactly.
To not have that kind of rumination going on in your brain the whole time too.
Exactly.
Yes. Thank you so much, Kara. If you want to learn more about this topic, we certainly referenced a lot of other conversations that we've had today. So I would make sure to look at the description box where you found this podcast to find some links to those former episodes, both about Ellen Satter's competency skills, about our conversation with Mary Cain, our conversation about was I only fast because I was anorexic, etc. So make sure that you check that out and listen along for more information. And to be updated about new releases, make sure you are subscribed to the podcast. If you want to learn more about Opal, you can follow along with us on social media, on Instagram and Facebook at Opal Food and Body. Or if you want to learn more about our community events and our programming, make sure you go to opalfoodandbody.com. Thank you so much to Daniel Gunther at Jack Strahl Cultural Center for sound engineering, to Aaron Davidson for the Appetite's original music, and to Hans Anderson for editing. Join us next time.